Hello. Let us resume our discussion on how to write critical appreciation of a poem. In my previous lectures, that means there were two lectures, as you can see from the playlist of this critical appreciation. I have discussed something about how to write an critical appreciation, and at the same time, what are the basic differences between critical appreciation and substances, that is, critical substances, and what are the two major sections that a student has to focus on while appreciating a poem. So now let us discuss about the two sections in detail. First, there is the content or theme-oriented interpretation. As you see, as I've mentioned in my last lecture or last discussion, that there are two major sections. The first one is the content or theme-oriented interpretation of a text, and the second one is, the most importantly, the structural aspects of the text. Now, what happens, that whenever we find the students are writing their answers regarding this appreciating of a poem critically, then in most of the answer scripts we find that the focus is being given on the summary, and the structural part is completely being omitted from his or her answers. So that should be rectified, truly. And in this particular lecture, first I will discuss on the content or theme oriented interpretation of a text, and in the due course, that means in the next few lectures, we will find that how the structural aspects had to be addressed. Now, the first thing you see, that whenever you will find a particular text being mentioned in your or it is being present in your question paper, just read the text carefully or read the lines carefully. First of all, what happens, that ultimately when we try to read a poem, at the first reading there are ample references, or something is missing, you see, that from the first reading you cannot identify what the text actually indicates. That's why you need to read at least 3 or 4 times first. Okay, go through the poem line by line, and then try to identify first that what is the type of the poem. Eventually you will find that the poems are to be considered to be important regarding its basic resurgences of love poetry or didactic poetry or patriotic poetry, or maybe you will find that the poetry or the poem can also address some social crisis. That means it must have to be a kind of a social poem. So try to identify that. Now the question is uh, that how do you feel that this particular poem actually falls under the group of love poems? How do you feel that the poem is actually, that you think that the poem is celebrating didacticism or maybe spiritualism? How can you feel that the poet is or the poetry or the poem is carrying a kind of a patriotic fervor? Or maybe through the poem, the poet is trying to criticize a particular social ethos, or maybe the society itself, or maybe something satiric. Express what makes you feel this. Now, that is very important and very significant regarding critical appreciation, that whenever you will do with critical appreciation, you have to think about the poem, what type of poem it is. But remember one particular thing: don't try to write anything that cannot be justified by you. That means each and every time you have to justify your argument. I have already told you in my previous discussions that suppose you are the critic, and now the work of a critic is to criticize the text on the basis of the text itself. It is not that I am thinking this particular poem is belonging to love poem, and then you are writing, yes, this is a poem that belongs to the love category. Or you can find that, yes, ultimately this particular poem is a religious poem. Now, this will not do. What you have to do, that whenever you will come to any particular position, whenever you will come to any particular condition, that this particular poem is a didactic poem, this particular poem is a patriotic poem, this particular poem is a social poem, or maybe satiric poem, you have to express what makes you feel this. That means you need some support. Your arguments have to be supported by some informations. Your arguments have to be supported by some words, phrases, some temperament that actually these words will carry. Okay, and now after identifying and justifying the type of the poem, or what actually makes you feel that this particular poem belongs to a love poem or didactic poem or patriotic poem, etc., now you have to move towards the critical summary. But one thing, remember one thing, that ultimately I have already mentioned that critical appreciation and a kind of a substance writing are vastly different, right? So while writing a critical summary, you will find two things to be important. What? The first one is the literal meaning. That means what the lines actually propagate, or what actually lines it makes to be visible in front of you, right? The second thing is the inner meaning. You can find what I'm trying to suggest here, that the lines are to some extent indicating us that this particular poem is actually saying this, but whenever you will try to identify the text better, then you will find some inner meaning is also being associated with this particular poem. So while writing a kind of a critical summary, you see, you need to do with the literal meaning of the text and at the same time the inner meaning of the text. But remember one thing, that you have to follow the new critical pattern of summarizing the text. Now the question certainly arises, what does this new critical pattern of summarizing the text actually means? Ultimately, what I'm trying to suggest in my first lecture, in my first discussion on critical appreciation of a poem, I have told you something about the new criticism. What is new criticism? What are the basic thrust of the new critics? And now I will tell you what is the new critical style of interpreting a text, new critical style of summarizing a text, or maybe a kind of appreciating a text. What happens, that the new critical style actually uses direct phrases from the text, right? That means, suppose now you are creating a kind of a critical summary, and you have to go line by line with the poem. So it is better for you to refer to the exact phraseologies, exact words, okay, or lexicons that have been taken in this particular poem, and try to use those words, try to use those phrases, okay, and develop your writing. That means, suppose you were writing on say Ode to Nightingale by John Keats, and it will be your focus that John Keats is trying to focus on a kind of eulogizing a particular concept. Here you have to think that nightingale is no longer to be considered as a bird. Rather, the nightingale has become Keats's nightingale. Now, while doing so, say for example, where Keats writes that away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his birds, but the viewless wings of poesy. So ultimately, what I'm trying to suggest, that here you have to use the phraseologies. You have to write that I will fly to thee. This particular phrase, for example, is just for example. When you will write that this particular poem, it seems to be dealing with a kind of an escapist notion. That means here in this particular poem, Keats is trying to evade all the responsibilities, or maybe to some extent he is trying to move for an alternative world. And then you have to identify that what actually makes you feel that kids is trying to fly from this particular situation. It is better to summarize the particular thing, but ultimately you have to use the phrases. You should use I will fly to thee, this particular phrase within quote, and use this particular quote in your sentence. Try to construct your sentence so that the phrase that you are quoting from the text, it can be made as a part of your sentence. That is very important, you know. Why? Because it will make the examiner or maybe the evaluator to understand that you are developing your answer on the basis of the text itself. Because as we have already I have already discussed in my previous lecture, that this particular pattern of critical appreciation, it actually deals with, or it begins with rather, the practical criticism of I. Richards, you see. So, justifiably, you have to follow the patterns of writing. You needn't have to think about the external impulses. You needn't have to think about the poet. Rather, the text will discuss everything. The text will say everything. So, whenever you are trying to develop an answer, you are trying to develop a kind of a critical summary, then you have to focus on each and every words that have been mentioned by the poet in this particular poem. And step by step, you have to move from the beginning to the end, right? With the help of the words, with the help of the phrases. So that is very important in this particular reference. That is, you have to use the direct phrases from the text and you have to develop your writing. Now, the most significant aspect of a particular poem, you see, that whenever you will go with any particular poem or any particular text, whether it is drama or poem or novel, anything, but here I will discuss about the poem. You will find that in that particular poem, there is a certain kind of a conflict. You know what is conflict? Conflict, this very term, is actually focusing on a kind of, you see, a kind of a clash between two paradigms. What is paradigm? I will discuss in my discussion on this particular reference, in this particular topic, this critical appreciation, where in the structural part, that means the structure oriented interpretation part, that is paradigm, that is a part of structuralism, obviously. uh, so what I'm trying to suggest here, that each and every poem has a kind of a conflict, you see. And what kind of conflict? The conflict between two ideologies, the conflict between two ideas, rather. Okay, take one particular example. Say, if I say here that you were reading a particular sonnet by Shakespeare, you have probably found, if you have gone through the some of the texts or some of the sonnets by Shakespeare, then ultimately some of Shakespearean sonnets are actually eulogizing WH, that is the beauty of fair youth. Some of the poems are directly addressing to the dark lady. Some of the texts are focusing on a kind of a reference to permanence and mutability. What is permanence and mutability? That is, one thing is permanent, that means beyond the grab of time or grasp of time rather, and another part is mutable, that is within the grasp of time, that is transient and transitory. In some of the poems of Shakespeare, you will find that somehow the love, the kind of a feeling that Shakespeare carries for fair youth, it has made certain, you see, and it will be sustained to some extent. That means you will find that though the beauty of the fair youth, or maybe the love for fair youth that Shakespeare or the poet persona does feel, these will to some extent uh, these will move beyond the grasp of time, because time, love is not time's fool, Shakespeare writes. Though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. That means that ultimately the physical beauty of each and every personages, these are within the grasp of time. Time is being considered as having a scythe or sickle. So ultimately, it has been pointed out here in this particular reference that time itself, it cuts and gathers beauty from beautiful women. But so far as the beauty of fair youth is concerned, it is beyond the grasp of time. And true love that is being associated with him, it is to some extent to be considered as beyond the grasp of time too. So ultimately, you will find that here, time and love, these two paradigms have been set. Okay, so the conflict in this particular poem, you will find that it is belonging to love, the true nature of love, that is physical love and spiritual love. The conflict is there regarding the definition of love, or rather you will say that the time versus love, it is another kind of a conflict that is being pointed out here. The same thing we'll find in the poem Sun Rising by John Donne. There also time paradigm and love paradigm is working. I will discuss it later in detail when I will discuss about the paradigm and the paradigm shift of a particular poem. How can you identify or understand while appreciating any particular step? So ultimately, what I'm trying to suggest here, that identify the main conflict. If you be able to identify the main conflict of the poem, then you will win half the game. That means the whole discussion will develop on the basis of that particular conflict. Why? Because you will find that that is the crux of the poem. Okay. Simultaneously, we'll find that the poet is developing his arguments with the help of some words and phrases. Okay, just to focus on, or just to come to a particular kind of a conclusion, that which wins over what, right? So that is the fundamental thing, and develop your argument on the basis of this particular conflict. Okay, so up to this, I will resume, or I will continue to think about it, or discuss about it in my next class. Thank you.